So my name is Carolyn Young, and welcome everybody to the third or fourth webinar in a series of webinars on the organic standards called Your Standards, Your Say. And this webinar is going to be on cannabis and marijuana products. So why are we talking about this at all? Well, currently, first of all, I should say thank you to Dicentra Cannabis Consulting for sponsoring this particular webinar. And I'd also like to thank, we have a couple of sponsors who have helped to sponsor the series of webinars, Cambrian Solutions and Freeman Herbs. And I also wanted to say before we get started that we should make sure your audio and video are both turned off if you're a participant. If you have questions, you can send them anytime during the webinar. You can send them through what's called the chat function, and you should be able to see this little bubble and write to either the host specifically and privately if you have any problems, or you can send it to all participants. And we'll make sure that we try and respond to that question. And at the end of the webinar, we will even ask you to speak out loud. We can unmute you and allow you to ask your questions yourself if that's what you'd like. I also want to let everyone know that we are recording this call and we will be sharing that with the participants and in the future with the public. So, and unfortunately, if you're having any particular specific problems with Zoom, the best thing to do is to reach Zoom support. We can't deal with everybody's issues while hosting the webinar. So without further ado, first of all, I want to say my name is Carolyn Young. I'm the Executive Director of the Organic Council of Ontario, and OCO, as well as the Canadian Organic Growers, have been putting on these webinars. And part of the reason why we're putting on these webinars is because the organic standards are currently under review. They have to be reviewed every 5 years, and the last version was released 2015. Another version will be needed for 2020, and so we have already started the process of reviewing the standards and taking proposals for changes. So I'll be talking a little bit more about that in the next little bit. And then we have Av Singh from Nova Scotia here. He's a cannabis consultant. He's going to do sort of some broad questions about why are we talking about organic cannabis or marijuana in general, and how does it fit within the current standards? What are the challenges? What are the gaps? And what needs clarification? And then we have David Kohlmeyer, who's an OCO board member and Dicentra consultant. He is going to specifically deal with the standards, get into more of the details. And he also sits on the Greenhouse Working Group for the standards review. And there has been some discussion and recommendations there to accommodate marijuana. We also have Adam Gibson with us. He'll be talking a little bit more about the political landscape, Health Canada, and the standards, and where those two things overlap, intersect, and maybe don't intersect enough. We have David Perrin, who's here from the Green Organic Dutchman, and he can speak directly to some of the challenges with organic cannabis and marijuana products. And finally, we have Dave Lockman from ProCert Organic, ProCert Certification Services. I never say this right. I'm sorry, Dave. Who's going to provide any clarity on specific certification questions that you may have. We also have Eric Pesa in the background from EcoCert. So around 1:05, we're going to open it up to questions for all the panelists. And unfortunately, Av has to leave early around 12:30. So if you have any specific questions for him, please chat them before that time. So just a brief overview again about why we're talking about this. For all of you who are standards experts, you'll know this by like the back of your hand. But for those of you who aren't very familiar, currently the Canadian organic standards are standards that are referred to by the Safe Food for Canadians regulations, which have just coming into effect now. It used to be the organic products regulations. And in general, how this works is that the regulations are the legal document and they refer to the standards, which are an industry standard and can be changed as a document that's referred to by industry. And so we have, but we have this process to maintain those standards and to update them every 5 years. But in the meantime, when there are questions about what the standards mean, we do have what's called the Standards Interpretation Committee, which is hosted by the CFIA, I believe. Please correct me if I'm wrong, everyone. And in order to change or update the standards every 5 years, we also have what's called the Canadian General Standards Board Committee on Organic Agriculture and the Technical Committee, which have a vote on those changes in the changes that take place. So those are two sort of CFIA managed bodies, I guess you could say. But then we also have what's called the Organic Federation of Canada, which is an industry body that has representation from each of the provinces. And they are the ones who really manage the process of maintaining and updating the standards, as well as the science cluster funding that we have. So they're the experts on these issues, and they're mostly representatives of producers and industry stakeholders. So the review process is managed by OFC, and in order to take the petitions that are made by industry stakeholders and review them and come up with really specific recommendations, the OFC has working groups, which are all industry members with particular interests and specialties, who look at those petitions and work through them and make decisions on them, recommendations that then go to the technical committee for review or for a vote. And on the other side, of course, we have the whole certification system, which is under the core, overseen by CFIA, but delegated some of those authorities to the conformity verification bodies, the certifying bodies, who then inspect operators. Oh, sorry. So I won't get into too much on this, but we do adhere to International Standards Organization guidelines, which is a lot of how the process of reviewing those standards are structured is based on those guidelines. And the standards really outline the principles and guide organic agriculture, and the processing side as well. They're slightly different than, for example, in other jurisdictions where standards are actually integrated into the regulations and are therefore owned and regulated by the governments. In the US, that's the case, but here we don't have that. And in fact, many people feel that that's one of the main advantages of the Canadian organic standards, is that we have more control over them, but it also means that we have to fund them currently. But the review process is mandated by the Canadian General Standards Boards, and they oversee this process. And if we didn't update our standards every 5 years, they would be archived. So we're kind of forced into a situation where we have to pay for those standards to be updated, because the CGSB requires revenue. It's a revenue neutral agency. So the process is underway right now. Most of the working groups are quite active at the moment. The petitions were requested. There was a deadline in July, but working groups are making recommendations all throughout now until November. And then I think that a review of the first draft of the standards will happen in March. I could be wrong on that, but I think that they're going to be released next year, 2019, for public comment. So we're hosting these webinars sort of in conjunction with that process, so that there is a bit more engagement in the process, and so that we can provide some of this feedback to working groups as they go forward. Some of the working groups that exist: greenhouse, maple, sprouts. The livestock working group includes poultry, pigs, ruminants, and honey, and then there's a processing working group. And you can find all the information of who's involved in those working groups on the OFC website. Okay, so that's all I have to say about the review process. And why we're talking about cannabis, I think, is that while we may not be able to embed it specifically in the standards at this time, and I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that the agricultural standards still do have some bearing on what is considered organic within cannabis and marijuana production. So hopefully our experts can help illuminate that a little bit more. So I'm going to pass over the mic to, let me see, who did I say? Av.
Thanks, Carolyn. And once again, I want to thank the OCO and the Canadian Organic Growers for putting this on, as well as Dicentra for sponsoring. So I just want to start by just mentioning how the Canadian Food Inspection Agency was essentially invited kind of late to the dance when it came to non-hemp cannabis. Health Canada was regulating it solely, and it really wasn't under the jurisdiction of CFIA until most recently nearing around legalization. And so prior to that, there were companies like Whistler Medicinal and or Rubicon and the Green Organic Dutchman that and Organigram, I guess, that would have been looking at certifying their process as organic, and it turned to certifying bodies and or created their own organic standards to try to exemplify that their product was indeed organic, or at least their process of cultivation was organic. And so subsequently, so there was a lot of talk within the sector, should we create our own standards? And so it eventually came about that Health Canada invited CFIA to be part of the dance. And CFIA, of course, then has the jurisdiction over crops as well as food. And so the engagement began. What's interesting to note is that the concept of having unique standards like honey production or maple or mushrooms or sprouts was not necessarily required for cannabis. Of course, hemp has always been included in the organic standards, and with the recent Cannabis Act, it allows for outdoor growing as well. So cannabis can be grown outdoors. This would be, cannabis sativa greater than 0.3% THC, which is the definition of what is hemp. So that aspect, as well as the fact that edibles are going to be coming on stream supposedly in 2019, really called for CFIA to get engaged. So instead of creating unique standards just for cannabis, when we look at how cannabis production is primarily being done within the sector, we see that for the most part, the process of cannabis production, and I'm sure David Perron will go into greater detail around this, but it's essentially cannabis is a dioecious plant, so there's males and females. What we're really looking for is that unfertilized female flower. Oftentimes, cannabis is propagated for the most part using cuttings, which we call clones, and that comes from mother plants. So you have a mother room and then a propagation room in which you take some clones and then you keep them in a vegetative state. Usually that's geared to around day length. So they receive 18 hours, typically 18 hours of daylight, 6 hours of darkness, and then they're transitioned into flowering, which for most of our standard licensed producers, they're typically looking at a flowering period of between 8 and 10 weeks. In the flowering period, the plant receives 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of darkness. When we look at where does cannabis kind of fit in these regular standards, and what are the points that might be the most controversial, and I think David Kohlmeyer is going to go in greater detail around some of these. But I highlighted that the major issues are typically soil, light, energy, and labor. So when we look at soil, it's not only the fact that our organic standards are trying to maintain some integrity around the importance of soil in the actual quality of the product that's being produced, but we also have to define what is soil. So what do we call soil? And what's a suitable quantity for soil to grow a plant? And when we look at, if we were to compare this to existing standards, we see that we have standards for container systems, those systems that are staked using trellises or staked crops, typically eggplant, peppers, tomatoes, cucumbers. And then we have a specific volume of soil that's required for that. When we look at our typical production within the cannabis sector, we really do meet those standards around the quantity of soil. Despite the fact that cannabis is a relatively short period plant, the whole life cycle will typically be around 14 weeks. Most of the producers that I've had that are growing in what I would consider a soil are definitely using an adequate volume of soil. The next question is, what is soil? And I think David Kohlmeyer will discuss a little bit more about what that is. So I'm not really going to get into details on that. I did want to talk about light. So if you look at the existing standards, it does comment for the most part, if you are to use artificial lighting is to be a supplement to natural lighting. And in many cases, that's not the situation for some growers in the cannabis sector. So we have many facilities that are strictly warehouse facilities. They will do all of their cultivation in a warehouse using artificial lights, whether that be high pressure sodium, ceramic metal halides, or light emitting diodes, LEDs. That in that case, we would be having some challenges to the existing standards where our plants are not receiving natural light to any extent. The other 2 points that I just wanted to highlight would be more about the philosophy of organic and how does cannabis fit into that philosophy. I'm definitely a strong advocate that cannabis is a phenomenal plant and a phenomenal plant not only to the soil but to our own human health. So I think it's a valuable product and one that should be included in the organic system. But how does it fit into the philosophy around energy and sustainability? I think this is one of the biggest challenges that the cannabis industry faces, and I think the Canadian government has recognized that and is starting to promote outdoor growing. So I think that's going to be a strong component to the organic sector, is that we'll see some increased outdoor growing, where definitely the energy demands are going to be far less than that of either greenhouse facilities and or warehouse facilities, where lights are the major, are a big component of electricity, but also the heating, ventilation, air conditioning, the HVAC systems are also quite demanding. In terms of other potential increases in the organic sector because of the new changes, microcultivation is being permitted. That is also something that small scale farmers can get engaged in and go organic. They can grow those products outdoors. So we in many ways, we are looking at some of the issues around reducing energy demand to produce the product, but we do have to kind of address the concerns of warehouse growing and greenhouse growing on energy. And the last point that I just want to talk about is kind of the importance of labor and just the other philosophical practices that I kind of think fit into sort of an organic 3.0 mentality. I'm very proud to say that when I look at the cannabis sector, they are definitely striving to create ideal working conditions for laborers. I can see that temporary foreign workers will be increasingly used within the sector. I do see strong pushes within the space around addressing gender issues. I've not been to a conference yet that hasn't pushed the idea of increasing women participation within the sector. And definitely when you walk into these rooms, there is a strong push for Indigenous rights, Indigenous participation within the sector, as well as people of color. So definitely there's always areas of improvement for the cannabis sector, but I'm quite happy to see that they are willing to do some navel gazing and start addressing some of the challenges.
Okay, thank you so much, Av.
That would be it, Carolyn.
Yeah, I think what we'll do is I think if anyone has any specific questions for Av, it would be a good idea to chat them in the next 10 to 20 minutes. But I just before you go on, Av, I just wanted to ask the question. So you mentioned that hemp is already covered by the organic standards. Can you just elaborate on that very quickly?
Oh, yeah, just, I can speak more about it as, just a phenomenal crop in terms of soil building, but we've got probably for almost 15 years, we've had certified organic hemp growers, actually probably longer than that. And so it's still governed by Health Canada in terms of that you go and you get your license through Health Canada to be able to grow hemp. There are set cultivars within the Health Canada, and it's nice to be able to say cultivars because you can't say that in most cannabis, but in hemp you can. It is true breeding line. So you actually have cultivars that have already been approved, that they don't have to get tested to make sure that they are under the 0.3% THC. There are some cultivars that aren't a license for that, so then you can still grow the product if Health Canada gives permission to grow it, but they would then have inspectors come and test it for THC potency. And it's been I think very favorable. The price for hemp hearts were very, very lucrative, and now Health Canada has given the permission to be able to extract cannabidiol from hemp, and so we can expect to see a dramatic increase in organic hemp.
Okay, great. David, I'm going to ask you next to come on next. So I'll just move your slides along as you need them. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Well, for those who aren't already in the organic sector, I'd like to emphasize the first line there, that organic production is not what is not done. In other words, what's banned and not disallowed, prohibited, and so on. It's primarily about what is done. And I think this is summarized best from where I got this quote. I was lucky enough to have lunch with Robert Rodale a few months before he was killed in an automobile accident. It was his father who coined the word organic back in 1939. And by that he meant not using the pesticides and herbicides and so on, because following good practices of increasing organic matter in the soil, you wouldn't need all these pesticides and herbicides to use at all. So it should be a more positive approach rather than a negative approach. And then I thought just real briefly, I'll just mention the very beginning of the standards is listing the IFOAM principles. And there's 4 of them. One is health, and that includes water and soil, but also animals, humans, and the planet. So that's kind of the sustainability part of it. Ecology, and that's with agriculture and food production and so on, should definitely be using the ecological systems and cycles. And work that I'm research work that I'm doing now, we're seeing that very clearly, that having good biological activity in the soil trumps even the total fertility levels. So ecology is very important. Fairness, so it's fairness not only to people, but also the environment. So in some countries, organic is considered more about the fair labor practices than food safety or sustainability and so on, which is the case in Canada. And then care. I think a key word of that is precautionary. So it's health and of us now, health of the planet, and for future generations as well. So those are the underlying principles of what we're talking about with organic. So the next slide. Now, just to explain something that's probably hard to get your head around is the regulatory organizations, or Health Canada, which regulates cannabis. But it gets confusing because the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, which is part of Agriculture Canada, regulates feed and animals, which we're not talking about specifically, but the Safe Food for Canadians Act. That's food specifically. So it gets confusing, is cannabis a food or is it a drug? And that's where we get the difficulty. And until these two departments, Health Canada and Agriculture Canada, through CFIA, start working together, we can't have normal organic certification. And that's a bit of an issue that we can say that it follows the standards, but you can't receive the certification or use the logo. Another regulatory body is the Ontario Minister of Agriculture. And as of right now, the term organic is not regulated, but actually tomorrow it's going into second reading. So hopefully this loophole is going to be plugged very soon. So next slide. So the standards is what we're talking about mostly today, and they're administered by the CFIA. There's two parts of it that we're talking about, and that's the general principles of the standards. And then the second one, the 32.311, is a list of the permitted substances and processes. So those are two fairly lengthy documents, and I can't say I'm an expert in these because I'm not enough of a legal mind to understand all the ins and outs. But what I'm going to do is talk about the standards that we have now, but just in relationship to most cannabis production. So next slide. Okay, there's the key ones with the standards, and I'll just go through those. I guess the beginning is the mother plants that Av discussed. Those need to be organically produced, either starting that way, or they need to have at least 12 months of growing in the meantime. So that's a bit of an issue. Now, if you start from seed, that doesn't become a problem. It's just the perennials. If you start with a purchased perennial that was not being done organically. And then if you're getting certified organic in a facility, I guess Dave Lockman will explain this, because some people seem to get it less than 15 months, but generally it's 15 months before you can start selling as organic. Now, a key thing is hydroponic production is not allowed. This is how it's going in Europe, but in the US, they do allow organic hydroponic production being organic. So currently it's not allowed, and the greenhouse task force that I'm working on will continue that, not allowing hydroponic. Now, of course, you get into a definition of where's the difference between hydroponic and organic soil. So it's kind of still a bit of a gray area. But we'll try to clarify that as best we can without being too prescriptive. So right now, the soil used in organic growing must contain, number one, a mineral fraction. So that's like not solubilized, not a liquid part of it, but a solid mineral. An organic fraction, which would be organic material, so like carbon, I'm not talking about certified organic, but something with carbon in it, like peat moss or coir, worm castings, and so on. And then the life has to have be able to support biological activity. So some sort of ecosystem in the soil and supported by that. So that's a really important part of organic soil in the fields, but also in greenhouse production. There's one thing that's mentioned in there, that soil regeneration shall be practiced. Now, people that are growing in greenhouses get really nervous about diseases, so you can replace it, but then it must be reused outside the greenhouse for another crop. Well, a lot of greenhouse growers don't have another crop, so I guess Dave Lockman will explain how that is covered. Okay, greenhouse production in the current standards only anticipates staked crops. Now, I do know that I don't think staking is really done anymore for any of these, but that's the term that's used. That's tomatoes and peppers, cucumbers that climb up a string, and so on. These are required to have at least 60 liters of soil, which you've talked about, per square meter of growing area. So that's the photosensitive area that the leaves will do. So inspectors were having a problem if having the soil related to the canopy, because when they come and inspect it, you don't know what stage they're inspecting it. So they need something firm to deal with. I should mention one thing is that soil is right now is to have 10% compost included in the soil mix. So this kind of gets it away from hydroponics. And then non-staked crops, which generally I think cannabis would be considered as not staked, but it might be trellised. So it has no specific requirements. So it gets a bit confusing on there, and that's why we're revising this to make it a bit more clear, and I'll talk about that in a minute. In the greenhouse, you're allowed to have supplemental heat, supplemental lighting, which makes it pretty clear that, to me, that it can't be done in a warehouse where there is no or very minimal sunlight. And CO2 enrichment is permitted. So only permitted substances are allowed in fertility, which we've been talking about, and you can add probiotics, that's allowed. Natural soil wetting, permitted pesticides are allowed. Growth regulators, as long as they're natural, not synthetic. Equipment sanitizing, there's lots of things that are allowed. And a lot of these regulations of the materials allowed are already in the health standards, the Health Canada standards. So there's not a lot of differences between them. packaging, processing rules, and extracting agents. That's probably a bit more limited in what's allowed, and I won't get into the details of what those are. One key one with that relates to cannabis is the radiation rules. It's just not allowed. So you need to follow good, healthy practices so that you don't need the radiation, and that's a key one. And not mentioned as this is UV sterilized water, sort of a radiation. Soil pasteurization, which might be a way to get around disease problems building up in the soil and getting the tremendous benefits of recycling the soil, because that really boosts the biological activity. Photocatalytic oxidation, doesn't really say anything about it, or air conditioning, which is maybe an energy thing. So next slide. So I'm sitting on the Greenhouse Task Force, which is just about finished doing the recommendations for the new standards in 2020. We're changing the name of this to sheltered, so because it's not just greenhouses, but tunnels and various covered high tunnels and so on, instead of just greenhouses. And then putting in there container growing and talking about that specifically. And this would allow container growing outside. So you could start something in a greenhouse and finish the growing cycle outside. A lot of what we've done is simplified and clarified the statements that are in the existing standards so that they're a little easier to follow. The big change that we're recommending is that rather than having just 60 liters of soil per square meter, which really isn't enough soil, but it's enough for the, at least it's a minimum. So because marijuana and lettuces and strawberries and so on are maybe not growing as long a period of time, we have put it into a time element. So it's 2 liters soil per square meter of photosensitive area per week. So crops that are grown for 30 weeks would go up to the 60 liter, which is the maximum that goes up to. So this change, which wasn't anticipated for the 2015 standards, now allows us to grow, I think, virtually any crop in containers in sheltered structures. So we can grow just about anything you can think of in a greenhouse. Now the soil still has to have 10% compost when it's starting. And this is probably another big change, is that the soil is, as a grower, you should endeavor to have all the fertility in the soil, just like outdoor growers. You're allowed to put more on, but you kind of don't plan to. So you can add more fertilizers, and of course these would have to be approved, allowed. Artificial light, we're still looking at. So right now, this can only be supplemental, but there are people on the task force who do want to allow for warehouse growing. So I'm not sure where that's going to turn out, but we're having a meeting next week for that. So I guess, is that the next page? Is there another one? Or is that it? Okay, that's it.
Right.
Good.
Thanks, David. So I'm going to turn it over to Adam now. And I know there's probably a little bit of overlap in some of the presentations, but I feel like you each have a different perspective going on here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're a little bit muffled, but I think we can hear you as long as you're close to the mic. And I'm going to mute David.
I'll start things off very quickly about who is the Canadian Health Association, if you aren't aware. So we're Canada's largest trade association, focusing principally on natural health products, organic products. Membership is roughly split between a number of health food retailers as well as manufacturers of natural health products and organics. What brought us into the organic cannabis and cannabis conversations revolves heavily around CBD and its potential use in natural health products, other products. Yep.
I'm going to see if do you mind trying calling in, just because you are having some, it's cutting in and out a little bit.
Okay.
So, we'll just.
1 second, I'll call.
Yeah. Are there any questions that anyone wants to ask while we're waiting? I'll ask David a question quickly. David, while we're waiting for Adam, can you just explain if the group has spoken about the aquaponics standards and how this will affect cannabis?
We spoke about it. It seemed like everybody on the task force is not really sure where this came from. For those who aren't aware, the aquaponics standards just were released this year, 2018. I don't know why we didn't wait till 2020. And so we didn't really notice any serious differences with this, and we weren't sure what it's all about and why this aquaponics came along. So I guess I don't have a very good answer for you.
Adam, let's see if we can hear you now.
Sure, is this better?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll start from where I was on organic cannabis and what brought CHFA into this. I'm just gonna turn down my own. I'm getting feedback. Okay. Okay. You still hear me?
Yes, it's much better.
All right, terrific. So one of the biggest interests of the Canadian Health Food Association is around cannabidiol. We're seeing obviously a huge amount of demand. It was used extensively in the medical access program long before there was the recreational stream. And more or less what happened on October 17th is everything that had been previously accessed legally only through a doctor more or less became non-prescription in many people's minds. And so many people started turning to the recreational stream to access CBD products. Even though they didn't have a recreational purpose, they were still going there and buying them for health purpose. And so the big focus for CHFA has been to essentially regulate those as natural health products, because we know that that's kind of how they're being used. And so for us, there is a big advocacy push for looking at it from that perspective. But then overall, also thinking of it from an organic point of view, is we do have an advocacy agenda to try to expand the use of organic certification and the use of the logo beyond just food commodities. And this obviously fits very well into the conversation around how CBD and cannabis products may also be certified as organic. So leave it on this slide. I think the main thing I wanted to highlight around the use of the logo and certification and where things are going with cannabis right now is, if you look at how the government is treating cannabis products, they've created their own act, so the Cannabis Act. That pulls it away from the current Food and Drug Act. It pulls it away from food laws, pulls it away from everything else, and kind of treats it on its own. And where they're borrowing policy ideas and they're borrowing their approaches kind of comes from a bit of a mix between tobacco and alcohol. And so if you think of it as a recreational substance, you can look at cannabis as kind of falling in between them. And so if you start to think about, well, how could a logo be used? It's highly unlikely you would ever see a day where you might have the Canada Organic logo appearing on a pack of cigarettes, but it is impossible someday to imagine it appearing on a bottle of wine. And that's, I think, was one of the kind of the situations that's taking place around cannabis. There's a lot of debate about where did this really fit in and where could it potentially be used. So next slide, please. So very quickly, just about kind of demand. And so These stats are probably familiar to everyone. They were pulled from the OTA and the states around overall the organic demand, as well as some stuff from CODA. And so we obviously see a huge amount of demand coming from young people, so millennials, as well as other types of subsets. And the main thing we wanted to get across there is a growing demand, and when you see growing demand in younger populations, it kind of foreshadows what's likely to come. That's really important to politicians. They always want to get ahead of where young voters and where people are going to be thinking in the future. And so if we switch to the next slide, and we compare that to the type of demands you see for cannabis products, there's actually a pretty strong correlation there. So again, a lot of use in the young, a lot more familiarity with its use, and a pretty strong intersection in the types of demographics. So that's pure correlation. But this kind of reconciling of who's really interested in organics, who's really interested in the products that could be coming from cannabis, the fact that they're the same demographic will mean a lot to policymakers. And essentially for us, it gives us a great amount of leverage to really highlight that this is an important topic. It's not a nice to have. It is something that both the Canadian population is going to want or wants already, and it needs to be embedded in lawmaking and policymaking at the outset. So that's kind of what our arguments start to look like. So the next slide, please. So I've got a couple other challenges because there's a lot of rules and things to be written here, but just wanted to highlight a little bit of what are the challenges, and then I'll switch to some of the opportunities. I think it was already touched on a bit before. Organics in general have gotten pigeonholed as a food topic, and having them embedded in the Safe Food for Canadian regulation it's great to see them enshrined in law, but at the same time, having them enshrined in a law that is very commodity specific can be limiting in terms of how it can be used once you start looking at other kinds of outputs of agriculture. And so for us, this is a really important piece of the puzzle, given that cannabis products will not necessarily be linked specifically to food. They'll have many other uses. So getting that certification and then pulling it out of that space or having it recognized across different types of commodity law becomes really, really important. The other things that could become problematic are around marketing. So the Cannabis Act is very strict on marketing. And so the way it is looked at around cannabis products is that they're an addictive substance. They're considered to be, they're very, very concerned about giving access to the population for a recreational substance, but they don't want people to get addicted. So there's a whole bunch of really tight restrictions on marketing, and what we've seen so far from the government is not a lot of latitude about what could be added to labels around these products. So that's going to be a bit of an uphill battle when you start talking about logo. The other challenge is about edibles, and so the government's about to go into a consultation, probably either towards the end of this year or very, very early next year, around edible cannabis products. And the big thing there is that edibles in legalese are not food. Edibles will be regulated under the Cannabis Act, and food will be regulated under the Safe Food for Canadian regulations, as well as the Food and Drug Act. And so they're keeping a bright line between them, but at the same time, they're going to be borrowing a whole bunch of the thinking and the lawmaking from the food laws in order to apply to edibles. But at the same time, it won't be an automatic. And so there's a bit of an opportunity, but also a bit of a challenge there, because when we think of edibles, we obviously think we're eating something, but the laws are going to be dealt with very distinctly, because I think they're trying to be very, very careful about how the population starts to access this new substance. So I'll turn to the last specific slide I have. And so these are about some of the opportunities. So the good news is that a lot of the work that we're doing already is paving the way for the conversation and for the advancement of organics and cannabis. And some of that work that's already underway is the efforts that we're making to have organics be recognized outside of just food commodities. So whether that's natural health products, it could be cosmetics, it could be even textiles, any other types of places where you would see an organic output where it could be recognized, and you want to use a logo or just have it be recognized in other laws. There's a lot of work that's going on there, and that work paves the way for other commodities that could contain cannabis outputs. Likewise, we can leverage the government consultation around edibles. So even though they're regulating them separate from food, there is a huge amount of influence that food law is having on this, and the fact that this sector in particular has so much experience around organics in food, it makes it a really great timing for us to advance the conversation. So whether they're intending to openly consult on organics in edibles or not, it is a great time to raise it nonetheless. And so it is something that we'll be trying to raise in the next few months. And the last thing I would notice, something that I know CHFA has been focused on, is is I think there's a lot more information now specifically around the differences between THC and CBD, and there's a lot greater recognition that CBD really isn't meant to be treated and managed as that kind of recreational substance. And so I think there's the demand to see CBD in a suite of different commodities. You see it used more broadly besides or even removed from that recreational route. That I think will drive the conversation towards a place where it's easier to have a conversation about actually identifying those products as having been made from organic cannabis or organic hemp. Essentially, you're getting out of that place where we're worried about attracting people to a recreational substance or a substance of abuse. It's not a substance of abuse, so we can actually have a more stigma-free conversation around the use of the logo, as well as essentially attracting people and creating that demand for the organic cannabis growth. So I think there's a few different, kind of not battlegrounds, but different types of avenues, I think, for us to raise this conversation. But I think there's some opportunities to come to, and we're doing a lot of that good work already. So that was all I wanted to do, because it's highly speculative at this point, kind of how it's going to work. But I wanted to give a little bit of, I think, at least from my perspective, I'm the regulatory and policy director for CHFA, and so I spend my time mostly on the federal regulatory world. And so this is kind of the lay of the land of what we're seeing right now.
Thank you so much, Adam. This is amazing to get your perspective on this. And I think that, I encourage people to continue to work with CFHA as we go forward on the consultation here. So I'm just going to turn it over. We are running a little bit behind now. I'm going to turn it over to David Perron, just to give a little bit more of on the ground what are the current challenges and opportunities that you see.
Well, thank you, Carolyn. Thanks everybody for laying a very true picture of what the reality is from being certified organic. And like I've mentioned, and as David and Adam pointed out, we're going through the certification process for the credibility of the system that we're doing. It's not what we do, what we're not doing, we're not allowed to do, is all those extra steps that we're building to add value to our product, but also to ensure that those productions are more sustainable for the environment, and then patient or user will end up with a better experience and a cleaner product at the end. So having our growing process certified by an independent third party, because like I mentioned, as cannabis is not under CFI, we cannot certify the flower itself, but we can certify our growing process and have them reviewed and have a third party attesting that we do obey by the Canadian Standard Organic. The product has been grown under those standards. There's a lot of conflicting direction and guidelines when you're dealing with organic production standard and the Health Canada standard. And a good example I can give of that is pest control product. A lot of the product that we are allowed to use in organic growing are product that are based out of microbial agent, bacillus or other bacteria that will colonize leaf surface, will prevent powdery mildew or botrytis to infect a leaf. But when we're using those products, we end up creating a false positive on our product that we need to test at the end of our crop. So to be able to release a batch of cannabis to the market, we need to test it for total microbial content, heavy metals. We tested for pathogenic bacteria, so E. coli, salmonella, aflatoxins, so mycotoxins, heavy metal, but also we test for pesticides. And as far as I know, we're the first industry that's producing a plant that have to systematically test everything for pesticide, which raised some question with those outdoor grow that have been allowed on the new regulation, because pesticide drift is a thing. You can be as clean as you want. And just out of curiosity, we tested some organic product herself, and we do find trace amount of pesticide, and that's the other challenge with Health Canada. It's there, you have to report any presence of pesticide, although they're below the standard for the maximum threshold that you're allowed to have. You have to report it anyway, and they phrase the regulation in a very interesting way. So you have to be able to test. You have to be able to test for a minimum of 3 ppm, let's say. But if your equipment will test up to 3 ppb, you still have to report it. And it's, as far as I know, I think it's a non-compliance. So this drive testing does not drive the more sensitive testing for your product. So, like I've mentioned, those pest control products that are based on microbial product makes it very challenging when you're certified organic, because we cannot use irradiation, and we also have to test our final product not only for pathogenic bacteria, but for total aerobic plate count, which a good example of that is the yogurt would never pass that test because it's full of good beneficial bacteria. They don't make the distinction. It helps when you think about it that we're producing a medicine for people with a very compromised immune system, and that's where those decisions are coming from, and we have to make the cleanest medicine possible. And we're operating, most of the licensed producers are operating under the European Pharmacopoeia for oral medicine, but not having the ability, having this test that's capping the maximum amount of biology and having your final product makes it challenging for really. So a lot of the product that's end up not passing those tests will be used for oil extraction. So either mechanical extraction using water as a carrier, or CO2 as a supercritical solvent will be used for that. As far as the standard goes, having higher volume of soil definitely help in organic production, and establishing those living soil system or this living ecosystem is really beneficial. It helps as far as controlling pest insect in the soil, and it's something that if you truly want to be organic, you should strive for. And also producing organically, regarding the labor, does require higher labor amount because of the way that we apply fertilizer. It's often top dressed, dried powdered fertilizer that's added throughout the growing cycle. It requires more labor than just using soluble salt nutrients. So we do tend to use more people in organic agriculture and organic cannabis production, but that was one of the positive effect that we've seen for us, because we do tend to use more people in the community, and people tend to be very passionate and they're attracted to agriculture. So we're using a higher number of people. That helps build us a better relationship with our community, and helps up having a better acceptance of the different cannabis projects that we're having, because public acceptance is a really critical point. And then a lot of those licensed production facility that is going up here and there. There's a lot of misinformation about what producing under all those different standards, the Health Canada standard, the Canadian standard for organic production, and the municipal bylaw. So you get in that triangle where it gets very challenging to go through all those hoops and all that. But public acceptance and having a cleaner perception of a cleaner product we're producing really helps. As regarding to what Dave was mentioning regarding the lights and all of that, that was something that was pointed out to us in our previous inspection, that there is a decision that's going through at the moment to see if solely artificial lighting has been used. There's more and more LEDs that are getting closer to full spectrum and that are more energy efficient. For us, it's something that makes sense to use, because we do reduce our environmental energy consumption, and cannabis is a very, very energy consuming and demanding crop, especially when it's been driven by prohibition to be produced only inside. People had to hide to produce cannabis, and initially when we're applying for licenses, the main thing that Health Canada is looking for is for security. So we have to have a fence perimeter, access control with our greenhouses. We have to have security cleared personnel that can be in presence of cannabis. That changed since the Cannabis Act, but for the 4 years before that, it was very challenging, being the the head grower in a different licensed production facility, it took Health Canada 1 year before they issued a security clearance that allowed me to be in presence alone with cannabis. So for 1 year, having to wait for someone else to be able to go in your own grow room was challenging. It's still moving forward. We're making a lot of progress. There's a lot of more back and forth with Health Canada and the different licensed producer. Now we're asking each other questions more than just trying to prove to Health Canada that we're compliant. And with all those new outdoor grows and stuff like that, Health Canada is reaching more and more toward agrologists to truly understand the biology beyond cannabis, and not only the compliances and the public safety aspect, inventory control and security side of things. Yeah, so basically, I'd be happy to maybe talk a little bit more question. I know we're running short on time, so I'll keep it short. But there's definitely makes it challenging, but it's a very rewarding process. Like I was mentioning earlier, cannabis is a beautiful plant, and because we're doing so much testing on it from pesticide, but also for total chemical composition, total metabolite composition, it's very interesting to see how much more of a differentiator we get when we're producing organic cannabis versus or other crops. So some people were purchasing organic food or product before because it's ease their conscience, it's better for the environment, but also because of the amount of testing we're doing in cannabis, we can really see an increase in the quality of the final product when we're doing a really good organic growing system. So.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to encourage the participants, and I want to apologize. So the slides are a little bit off. So some of Adam's slides are the formatting changed for some reason. But I wanted to say that people should start to send in any questions that they might have. I'm going to pass over the mic to Dave Lockman to address any some of the questions that David Kohlmeyer raised and any other specific certification questions. But then we're going to open up the floor for questions from the participants. So Dave.
Thank you, Carolyn. Good afternoon. Well, there was lots of questions about the regulations and so forth. So actually it was a good presentation on that. When it comes to the Canadian Organic Standard, we have to remember that Canadian Organic Standard is a document that is totally separate from the Organic Products Regulation. Okay, so the Organic Product Regulation does reference the Canadian Organic Standard, but the Canadian Organic Standard stands by itself. So any notes within that standard related to the regulations do not really apply. Okay, so that goes with the question from David related to the 15-month. 15 months is a regulatory requirement. It's not a standard requirement. So there's a note which references the Organic Products Regulation, but it does not apply for the standard itself. So the fact that the standard is separate, it allows products which are considered outside the scope of the actual Canadian regulations to be certified, as long as those products are not also regulated within their own regulatory scheme. Okay, so this a good example is natural health products. So there's lots of natural health products which are being certified under the Canadian Organic Standard voluntarily, because they cannot be, because they're not part of the regulation. I mean, they can, most of the natural health products are being certified under the NOP, but there was actually, again, David was mentioning the NOP, but in the case of the NOP, the USDA does not allow cannabis products and cannabis to be actually be certified under the NOP, because it's considered, because federally, it's cannabis is considered to be prohibited. Okay, so the NOP allows hemp products to be certified, and actually CBD extracted from hemp to be certified, but not cannabis. So it's one of those little distinctions. So when it comes to cannabis, we consider, and we reviewed that, carefully several years ago and discussed it with our creditors, and we consider cannabis as being a plant, a cultivated plant, and therefore falls within the scope of the Canadian standards and therefore can be certified. when it comes to cannabis and certification, essentially there's no regulation. So anybody can call it organic if they want. They can invent themselves a standard. They can pretty much do whatever they want with the word organic because it's not regulated. Okay, since Health Canada does not regulate any organic claim whatsoever. So we certify on this basis. So in our case, actually, we are actually accredited by an international body, IOAS, to certify products which fall within the scope of the Canadian standard, but that are outside the scope of the regulations. So we issue our certification based on an accreditation, and there's oversight done on these products from another party. That's all I have to mention. If there's any other specific questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
I wanted to give Eric Pesser from EcoCert just an opportunity to say what their perspective on this is. Eric, are you there?
Yeah, sorry, I'm here. Just find the unmute button. Yeah, echoing everything that Dave said, and I mean, it's more or less the same. We only take on clients who are licensed medical producers. So even though recreational producers are contacting us, we don't take those clients on at this point in time.
Okay, so let me get this. I just want to paraphrase so that I can understand. So the growing process can be certified to the Canadian standards. It's not overseen, it's not regulated. So, you know, each certifying body decides whether or not that they will be willing to do so. But the actual product that falls under the Cannabis Act is not certified. So the mothers and anything over, is that correct, Dave?
And that comes from a memo dating back to July of 2014 from the CFIA, where they decided that cannabis was not considered a plant under the Canada Agricultural Products Act. Okay, so therefore, you can certify them as long as you want to anything that you want, or call it whatever you want, because they're not regulated. They don't consider it as a plant.
Right. And so you are actually you're certifying sort of as a private entity, unregulated, yes, but to the Canadian organic standards.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. This has been a lot of information for me, at least. I still am learning so much about the whole industry, not only the organic side, but just cannabis side. So I feel like there's still a lot of processing to go. So like all the different products that we need to think about. But so maybe I'll just start off the questions by asking each of the participants where they think there is the most likelihood of growth in the organic cannabis product category. So what areas of product do we think will actually see the most demand for organic certification in the future? So you'll have to unmute yourselves. I'll mute everybody. Does anyone want to start?
Yeah, this is Paul Chun from a company called Norleaf Foods, and I would echo the comment that just came over chat. We believe that edibles is going to be certainly one of the most attractive and most in-demand areas for organic certification.
So when you say edibles, can you give us some examples of what you're talking about?
Well, organic edibles can be broken into many categories, but commonly you think of confections, baked products, and beverages, and perhaps soluble powdered products.
Okay, and are you experiencing demand for that already?
Not necessarily from organics, but certainly in the edible spaces, we see a lot of interest in all of those categories. And certainly data that we would see coming up from the US through Colorado, Oregon, et cetera, would say that these are categories that are in high growth mode. So we're seeing in many of them 46% annual growth in the size of those categories.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. Anyone else?
This is Adam. I would agree with that. I think, can you hear me? Just making sure. Okay. I would agree with those statements. I think it's highly likely you would see a marriage of demand for organic and other food commodities being transferred to the edible world. Once I think we get to a place where you are seeing CBD products and other cannabis products potentially entering health product world, I think there is already demand for organics and the natural health products. I think that would be another place. And I think just health products in general, I think a lot of people would want to know if they're taking something for their health, that it's been prepared in a way that is, I think, not going to adversely impact their health. And so making sure that it's free of pesticides and other things like that, I think would be a concern for anyone taking a product for their health, including a cannabis-based product. So I think there's a few, I think, similarities there. And then there might be some others that we start to go out into other groups. Maybe it could become cosmetics next, but I think the edibles is probably the top one.
And are there any companies that already create organic products that are creating edibles as a separate line at this point?
Well, Carolyn, as you would know, the edibles are not a legal product as yet.
Oh, right. I should know that, but I don't. Right, because we're having consultation in 2019. Makes sense.
But there are certainly
in the States, though.
I think it'd be fair to say that there are many companies that are currently producing organic edibles that are interested and are on the path to produce edibles. And I say that from the perspective that we are one of those.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Another question. There's another question that's come up. So from Eric. Eric, do you want to just ask the question yourself? Or I can ask it. Okay. So,
yeah, I'm just curious because this has come up recently with in a discussion group where people were saying it was now easier to get it's easier to grow cannabis than hemp, right? Still, right? And if anyone who's more familiar with the government lobbying going on, perhaps David with the CHFA, in terms of if Health Canada would ever consider releasing the license restrictions on, I know it's pretty easy to get a license, right? But releasing them, or they're just too afraid that people may grow above 0.3% THC, or they'll use it to grow marijuana instead, and then it would be impossible to regulate. Or do we see a future where they simply drop hemp and it's treated as more or less like other agricultural products, commodities?
And hemp is not currently under the Cannabis Act, correct?
It is.
Oh, it is under that. Okay.
The hemp regulations were amalgamized with the Cannabis Act. So it's in so much it didn't necessarily change extensively, but they were amalgamized. So essentially, it's all covered in one legislation.
Mm-hmm.
I'll jump in maybe on that question. And so I got my crystal ball out, and I think if I was reading the way the government has gone about this with the recreational, in some ways I think they've kind of kept a very, very narrow focus on what their policy objective was of making cannabis recreational, and by doing that, they achieved their objective. They can say they did what they promised and what they set out to do. But at the same time, they created all sorts of interesting oddities around the fact that they went so hard for that one objective, but didn't necessarily reconcile it with a bunch of other things along the way, including something like you'd have observations that it's easier to grow cannabis potentially than hemp, or other things that we're seeing from our side where it's easier to buy a THC product than it is to buy like a kind of CBD product in some cases. And so there's all these interesting kind of consequences to that. And so I think what will happen in the next few years is they're going to be fixing and essentially cleaning up a lot of that stuff around the edges or the shoulders of what their original policy intent was. And one of the big things that I think that will influence that is what's going on in the States. And so if you weren't aware, the Farm Act that went through, there was 2 Farm Acts, one that went through Congress and one that went through the Senate. Embedded within that, it's a huge, huge act that the U.S. is putting in place. And within the Senate version that was essentially their version of the industrial hemp regulations, which included removing hemp from their version of the Controlled Drug Substances Act, and it would start to pave the way for hemp to be used in a whole bunch of different commodities, and it would make it more of just a general agricultural product. They were not looking at a federal level to make cannabis recreational. They're definitely looking at making at a federal level hemp much more accessible. And so to the extent that the US is going in a direction that is going to be a lot more liberal with the utilization of and likely the growing of hemp products, I think that would probably put us in a funny juxtaposition with them in terms of how we treat hemp in this country. And so again, I think there's, suffice to say, I don't think it's going to necessarily happen overnight, but I think that there's enough of a groundswell and a knowledge base now growing, in particular around hemp and hemp commodities, that we might be able to actually see a day where, yes, I think we are starting to move in that direction where hemp is a little bit more accessible, or a lot more accessible even. And I think it's just a lot of it's coming just from a knowledge, and essentially everyone's kind of shedding a lot of old stigma and a lot of old presumption about the products, and the more easily we can define essentially the different components like THC that cause concern. I think we'll get into a place where there is a little bit more liberal access, but that's me speculating, to be frank. But I'm basing that on what I'm seeing in some other jurisdictions, which are definitely a lot more hemp focused than we have been in Canada.
And what changed with those new regulation as well, to go to your point, is that now if you're a licensed producer with a processing license, that you're allowed to do extraction, hemp producer are now allowed to sell flower, so you can process them, so you can make an extract out of them, which was not allowed to do so today. So it's easier to get a hemp license to produce than to get a licensed production facility for medical cannabis. And so we can now grow industrial hemp for CBD purposes if there's a party that will buy the product, but that party needs to have an extraction license, a license under Health Canada, not only a hemp license.
I think another source of growth for the organic industry is people looking for higher quality components in the cannabis that they're using, either for medicinal or recreational. It'll probably be like organic foods, and we're seeing that if people are following organic regimens quite diligently, sometimes called beyond organic, particularly having higher soil biology, there's more components in the food crops, and I can't see why it wouldn't be the case for marijuana. And so I think as a result, people will have a better confidence that there'll be more of an entourage effect from the marijuana. And certainly a clear one that I hear often is the irradiation kind of destroys the flavor of the marijuana and the aromas. So people that want these flavors and aromas and feel they're good for them, or they just like the nature of it, that'll be certainly a source of a market for organic.
So another question that came up from somebody that just in my office place before I came in is, well, why do we need to be concerned about pesticides or other toxins if we're burning something, if we're smoking something, for example? Maybe somebody could speak to what some of the concerns might be.
There's the big one, like to me, and anybody feel free to jump on, is the delivery method. So when we're vaporizing something in or along directly into the bloodstream, it's not going to the same absorption that would the bodies normally go with food and all that. It's a way more direct thing. And this is especially true with concentrate because there are organic molecules, a lot of pesticides, and when we're extracting that in cannabis, we've seen that with hydrocarbon or CO2 extracts in the state, you end up concentrating cannabis at the same time. So you end up having a way more efficient delivery system with a higher dose of pesticide that you would get under a normal food crop. Other pesticide like myclobutanil, commercial name here is Nova 20 in Canada, actually denatures and transforms into cyanide when burned. And so it's not allowed in tobacco, and it's not allowed in cannabis as well. And those are some of the reasons why it's more of an issue.
There's another question here from Babalink Farm. Did you want to ask it yourself, or shall I ask it for you? I'm going to unmute you. You're unmuted now. Is that Pat? Okay, I will try asking the question on her behalf. Eventually, I would like to see hemp, etc., fitting into agroecology models like alley cropping that has the potential to lower pest problems, etc., through companion plants and etc. Lots of scope for on-farm testing here. Oh, she doesn't have a mic. Okay, so that's why. So I guess the question there is, you know, and it's a comment, but also a question is, are there benefits to incorporating hemp and other cannabis products in the growing system for pest reduction and that sort of thing? I don't know, David, or one of the Davids maybe be able to answer that.
I think there's always value in having a lot of biodiversity on your farm, or even in your indoor garden if you're allowed to do so. A couple of years ago, they removed the minimal cultivation surface required to apply for a hemp license. So now I think anybody can apply for a small license and just have a few.
It used to be 10 hectares.
Yeah, now I think there's no minimum thing. So I think anybody can grow some hemp if you apply prior to it. And also you don't need to give you a geographic coordinate before the license. They made it way easier to grow hemp. So that's something that I think your farm could do, the Babalink farm could do. I've never tried it. I've only grown cannabis under the ACMPR and the Cannabis Act system at the MNPR before that. So we see a lot of change and all that. As an anecdotal fact, companion plants, I've heard growers saying that then when they grow more than one strain in the same room, the strain doesn't test the same way. The plant signaling in the air may affect everything. Also, cannabis is a very aromatic plant. There's a lot of secondary metabolite present. So in theory, there could be some potential beneficial effect of having it as a companion plant and having other companion plants around cannabis as well.
Maybe you disorient some of the pollinators, which is
it does produce a lot of pollen to a male cannabis plant. So for pollinator,
right.
I haven't heard much about honey being made from male cannabis plant yet. I'd be curious to hear.
That'd be very interesting. Yeah. Well, I mean, the neonics issue, neonicotinoids are, I think, somewhat derived from the nicotine. There's like some kind of chemical component that's connected. Anyways,
yeah,
it's really interesting.
It's a lot of the seed coating on some of the beans and all that. Interestingly, I heard something recently was saying it's the neonic's been present for a while, but it's when they changed the horticultural equipment they started to use those pneumatic drills to push the seeds into the ground, which is really aerosolized some of that pesticide, where you see a bit more of a correlation with neonics and colony collapse disorder.
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of factors there. Oh, good. We have another question. Okay. This is from Tyler Tetro. I think that's your name. I apologize if I got it wrong. It says, as a craft cannabis micro cultivator growing in a small indoor facility, how does this fit into the organic regulations? Craft organic small batch is the market we are focusing on and seems to be not considered in mainstream conversations. Please comment. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think the same, as far as the organic regulation, the same would apply to you as they would apply to a large scale producers who you would have to fit the Canadian standard for organic production and make sure that you get audited by an independent third party. They have different pricing. So for your own business, making sure that if you're smaller and you have less overall sales volume, you'll make the good decision for you. But those micro licenses are just starting to come out, or getting more talk about that. But it's definitely the organic way is definitely an option for any organic cannabis, for any cannabis producers.
Yeah, and I think here in Ontario, David mentioned that we are working on getting regulation for the province. And one of the things that we did as part of this process is to look at, if we had regulation in the province of Ontario, what are the ways that we can make it more affordable and more accessible for smaller scale operations? So we actually produced a report on that. But of course, anything that goes through would have to be government approved. And so we don't have control over that. But I know, for example, ProCert has a small scale, a local organic certification that they do that's not necessarily to the Canadian organic regime, but it still is certifying to the standard. So I hope that helps. Oh, so it says, so to be clear, indoor grown under artificial lighting still qualified to be organic certified at the moment. David, I think that's a question for you, David Kohlmeyer. I think it's about how you interpret the standards currently.
Yeah, I think my reading of it is not allowed, but well, I think it is. Yeah. Maybe David Blockman can explain that better.
We are currently certified under EcoCert, and we do solely grow indoor under artificial light, but I'd be curious to hear David's Blockman talk on that one.
Yes, I will tell you the interpretation. Okay, as a certification body, we always look at the standard, okay, in a regulatory way. Okay, so, and somebody told me a long time ago, essentially, if you would stand in front of a judge, okay, would you be able to justify your interpretation? So when it comes to lighting, the standard has already set a precedent in the livestock section where it will specify if it requires natural lighting. Okay, so in the livestock, it specifies you require natural lighting and you can have artificial lighting to supplement and so forth. In this case, there's only 2 mention of lighting within the greenhouse section, 7.5.6, where it talks about supplemental lighting are permitted, and also in 7.5.9, where it says full spectrum lighting is permitted. Okay, there is actually no mention that natural light is required, and supplemental lighting can apply to pretty much anything. Okay, and you're supplementing light, you're adding light which is not there. So with the way the standard is written right now, I don't think there's enough there to be able to prohibit artificial lighting or require that there be a proportion of natural lighting.
Okay, so that was a very roundabout way of saying that it is allowed currently, depending on the interpretation of your certifying body. Yeah, so that might be an interesting question for the working group going forward. So I think, as David mentioned, they are trying to be more specific about how much natural lighting is required. Another question here, and then we're going to have to wrap up. Do you intend, this is from Shauna Nolan, do you intend to allow parallel production or split production of organic and non-organic cannabis in one facility? David or Eric, maybe? As
a certification body right now, I mean, we follow the Canadian Organic Standards, very specifically, and right now parallel production is prohibited within the same operation. So that's what we follow.
Mm-hmm. And by the same operation, that means within the same facility and under the same business license, correct?
It says, well, within the same operation. So an operation as a company itself, you produce, or if the product have to be visually distinct if you want to do different varieties and so forth. Okay, but essentially you cannot grow the same product as organic and non-organic.
So maybe if your 2 varieties are visually distinct, but I'm not sure why. I don't know if that exists or not.
Well, I mean, David can comment to that.
Yeah, well, depends who you ask. Some people will say, well, it's very, very different. There's a connoisseur. People will say weed is weed, but for Bird, there is a lot of the different, like, variety visually you can say, but the chemical analysis that we always do before release a batch, that's where you see the true distinction. Yeah, so underground, to go back to the questions, so I would say that you can grow 2 different strains, one organic, the other one not organic, probably, but it's also, when you do that, your certification body will look at your full process to make sure that there is no contamination. It will go down to the type of container you're using for your organic material, and your certified organic flowers and your non-organic flowers, you'll have to use different containers to ensure that there won't be contamination of different materials.
Right. And I mean, I guess it has to be visually distinguishable for a non-expert. I guess is the question. Yeah, that's an area where there's probably some gray.
That can be done there, probably.
Yeah. Well, and on that note, I'm going to segue to tomorrow. Actually, if anyone is interested, we are going to be discussing this issue of parallel production within the standard. So there is quite a movement within certain groups to get rid of that requirement or that prohibition, but then there are other people who believe that we really need to keep it. So we'll be discussing that tomorrow in a webinar. And I did just want to see, I think there was one more question maybe, but I'm going to have to leave it till later.
I can tell you that advanced nutrients are not certifiable organically, that's for sure.
Okay, advanced nutrients, yeah. So David just answered that question. So I want to thank everyone, and I thank our panelists, and to thank Laura and Dora, who are here in the background taking notes and everything. And I apologize that this is an area that I am totally unfamiliar with. And I'm so glad that we've had such an amazing group of experts here. I'm sure that this is a to be continued conversation. We have been recording this, and we will be sharing the recording with everyone once it's up on YouTube, and we'll have a password for now. But so we can share the slides and the presentation once we've got that covered. Thanks again to everyone who participated. Oh yes, and Laura's trying to get my attention to. We have, like David mentioned, tomorrow there's a private members bill called the Ontario Organic Products Act, and it's going to second reading tomorrow, and so we're quite excited about that. Unfortunately, it's going to be happening at the same time as our webinar, so I won't be able to go until after. But for anyone who is interested in seeing that, you're also welcome to go to Queen's Park and just let us know, and we'll give you the details. So thanks again, everyone, and stay tuned for more webinars. We have one other one planned in January, which is going to be about poultry and outdoor access, and we're also looking into organizing more. That'll just depend on our capacity and our time, so I'm sure there's more topics to cover. Thanks to all the panelists and participants, and we will be sharing a feedback form, and we'd be so happy to hear from you about what we could do to improve, but also what you liked. Okay, thanks again, everyone. I'm going to end the webinar now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank you. You need to.